me, it felt disingenuine and quite simply wrong to be sitting on the sidelines.
So Alberta MP Matt Genereux has left the sidelines and walked across the floor to join the Liberals. I'm Catherine Cullen, and this week on the House, the third Conservative floor crossing puts Mark Carney within reach of a majority government. Our Hill watchers look at how likely that is and consider why Pierre Poilievre can't seem to stop the bleeding. Also on the show, Canada's got a new defence industrial strategy. The government says it will get the military equipment it badly needs and boost Canada's economy. The minister in charge on why he believes this time the Canadian government can actually deliver. Plus, the NDP are looking for a new leader, and the result could have a big impact on the rest of Canadian politics. Should the party take the pragmatic approach or take a risk on a leader who wants to push the envelope? Two former MPs give us their take. We begin, though, with Donald Trump losing one tariff battle and pledging to amp up the trade war. The House is now in session.
Foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years are ecstatic. They're so happy. And they're dancing in the streets, but they won't be dancing for long, that I can assure you.
U.S. President Donald Trump promising a fight after the Supreme Court struck down his emergency tariffs. He imposed those tariffs on Canada over concerns about fentanyl and illegal migrants, then expanded them to dozens of other trading partners last April. Now, those tariffs have been struck down. Will things get better for Canada or worse? Brian Clow is one of the few Canadians who has been in the room with President Trump negotiating on behalf of the Canadian government. He was the lead on Canada-U.S. relations under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as well as Trudeau's Deputy Chief of Staff. Brian, thanks for making the time.
Good to be here.
First, we had the Supreme Court ruling, and there seemed to be some optimism, perhaps, from Canadian officials about that. A few hours later, Trump comes out and says he's putting 10% global tariffs down. What does this mean for Canada?
Well, first I'll say it is a good thing anytime somebody is standing up to this president and curtailing his powers, particularly when it relates to trade. So the Supreme Court's decision, it's a good thing. It's one less tool for the president. It's one less thing for the Canadians to worry about. But I don't think it dramatically changes the overall trade tariff landscape that Canada and the world is suffering from right now. And as we saw, as the administration said it would do, they've said they have alternatives. They've now announced those alternatives. So the pain is going to continue.
And when it comes to this 10% global tariff, does free trade, does CUSMA protect us from a lot of that? Or does the tariff picture get worse for Canada now? What do we think is going to happen?
Well, as usual with this president, we will see what the details say. If you take what he said, there will now be a 10% additional tariff on everything moving from Canada into the United States. Will that be on top of the tariffs that already exist on steel, aluminum, lumber, and other products? Will there be a CUSMA carve-out? We will see. My prediction is we will see a continued CUSMA exemption on CUSMA-compliant trade, and that's because this is a legal agreement that the United States has to adhere to. The very fact that he was just had this ruling from the Supreme Court that curtailed his powers tells me they're not going to test that by applying these tariffs to CUSMA products. But we'll see. The president believes strongly in his tariffs policy. He's very emboldened to enact it. And we'll see if he actually applies this tariff across the board.
You've been in these rooms. What do you think Canadian officials are doing right now to try to respond to this moment?
Well, I'm sure they're trying to find out exactly what we're talking about. What are the details? What is new? What has changed here on the tariff front? But I also know that they will be looking longer term the next few months as they continue to prepare to sit down with the administration to review the CUSMA agreement. We have a new ambassador in place. We have a new chief negotiator in place. They have very complementary skills. And they're the ones who are going to have to sit down across from Jameson Greer, from Howard Lutnick, and actually negotiate all these issues. But it's going to be tough. It was going to be tough coming into today. It's tough coming out of today. And that's because, as I said a moment ago, this president believes strongly in his tariff policies, and he's not going to back off easily.
You say it's going to be tough. I mean, what do you see when you look ahead to those negotiations that are so critical to Canada's economy?
Well, there are three buckets of issues that are going to need to be dealt with. One, the administration has identified all sorts of complaints they have about issues contained within the CUSMA agreement. You know, these are supply management. These are some digital sovereignty questions, online sovereignty issues that the administration has complained about, for example. Those are going to have to be dealt with. Then there's the sectoral tariffs that Trump has applied to various sectors like steel, aluminum, and lumber. These are going to have to be discussed. And then there's a third bucket, which I call the who knows what bucket, of things that the administration maybe today doesn't even know it's going to bring forward. We all lived through 2 weeks ago when the president had his tantrum about the Detroit-Windsor Bridge. 2 weeks before that, he was on about Bombardier jets. So there's constantly this unknown that Canada has to prepare for as best it can. And
we're all living in the who knows what bucket these days.
Exactly.
Listen,
it's going to be a rocky, messy few months.
Indeed. Well, listen, Brian, thank you for giving us some perspective on it. I appreciate your time today.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Former Justin Trudeau Deputy Chief of Staff, Brian Clow. A2 Generou. A third Conservative has now left party ranks to join the Liberals, Edmonton's Matt Generou. And now, maybe, possibly, if the stars align, Prime Minister Mark Carney could have a majority government within his grasp. What does this floor crossing mean for Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre as he wrestles with other problems within his team? Here to discuss is Stuart Thompson, Parliamentary Bureau Chief for the National Post, and Shannon Proudfoot, feature writer for the Globe and Mail. Stuart, Shannon, welcome back to the House.
Hey, Catherine.
Hi there.
Stuart, the third one we've seen, how big a deal is this particular move?
Yeah, I think that it's a bigger deal than the others. I'll say that, because this is an Alberta boy. This is a guy with a long history in the Conservative Party. And, I'm partial to the work of Alex Marland, who's a Canadian political science professor, who says, we think about ideology and partisanship and all these things, but it's social cost that's the big thing in a floor crossing. You lose all your friends. And if you're Chris D'Entremont in a province that's, kind of bipartisan, it's a big deal, but it's not a huge deal. For Matt Generou, you're losing a lot of friends when you do this. And if I'm the Conservative Party and I'm looking at this, you have to calculate that he took a big chance to do this. And there are probably others who you thought maybe wouldn't take a chance like that, who you're now second guessing. So I would be worried if I was the Conservatives, because, people like having friends. So it takes a lot to get them away from their friends.
Shannon, when we pull back, 3 floor crossings is pretty wild. Now, in this case, Generou said he was leaving in part because of Mark Carney's Davos speech. It made him think about the need for national unity, not wanting to sit on the sidelines. But again, when we zoom out and we look at these 3 as a whole, why is it that Mark Carney is having so much success luring Conservatives away from their party?
Yeah, and it's also the drip, drip, drip. Every month or two, there's a new one. This one, Matt Generou, there were really strong rumors about him back in the fall, and then they died down or were forcibly quelled by him and Pierre Poilievre saying, I'm stepping down for family reasons, but not until the spring. And this one, kind of like Michael Ma's defection, came out of nowhere. In this moment, there was no warning. There's lots of reasons people give for crossing the floor. They will always publicly give a very high-minded reason. In this case, it's for national unity, the Davos speech, blah, 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 which doesn't explain why there were rampant rumors 4 months before the Davos speech happened. But there's all kinds of reasons people cross the floor. Stuart's right, big social cost. But it could be, my party that I'm leaving feels like a loser. This party I'm going to feels like a winning team. I don't like the leader I'm leaving behind. I think the leader that I'm going to is either a nicer boss or has more vision or smells like a winner. But it doesn't matter any of those reasons. They're all bad for Pierre Poilievre and good for Mark Carney. And I think at a certain point, this becomes sort of a rock rolling down a hill. It's just this feeling of drip, drip, drip. When is the next one? This comes not long after Poilievre got this resounding approval from party members. But then within his caucus, there's people being peeled off one by one. It just, that negative momentum, I think, is incredibly damaging.
Yeah, Stuart, perhaps Pierre Poilievre had a little bit more spring in his step after that review. I don't think we would still say that's true now. And so it leaves us with the question, why can't he stop the bleeding?
Yeah, it was a short spring for Pierre Poilievre. And I think that leadership review was interesting, though, because when you spoke to people around that, it's not like they don't like Pierre Poilievre or, they have any problems with where he's ideologically taking the party. But almost everyone, you talk to MPs and they say, well, if there was an election soon, we'd probably get smoked. Mm-hmm. And If you're a sports fan and your team is saying, well, we don't have a chance in this one, that's a really bad sign, because most political parties, they can at least talk themselves into the chance. And when you look at the polls, it's not like the Liberals are 20 points clear right now. So,
although Carney is 20 points clear, Poilievre, or
Mark Carney's
like
personal numbers are pretty good. And I think that's what people are looking at. Approval of the government and approval of Carney are sky high right now. That could be something of a honeymoon effect, but it also could just be that Canadians are weighing in on how they feel about the government. We had a poll at Post Media that showed 46% of Albertans think that Carney's doing a good job.
Wow.
That's not a number you expect to find in a poll. So if the mood is a little glum in the Conservative Party, that's probably why. And Shannon's right. People like a winner, and MPs especially like a winner.
And Shannon, Matt Genereux is not the only problem Pierre Poilievre is facing, not even this week, because we saw him have something of a clash with one of his own MPs, Jamil Jivani. Jivani recently visiting his friend, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, along with other members of the Trump administration in Washington, D.C. Now, you could look at that trip and you could say, does it undermine Pierre Poilievre? Does it show the Conservatives are actually taking some action when it comes to the Canada-U.S. relationship? But then, after the trip, Jivani said this about Canada to the right-wing U.S. outlet Breitbart News.
We are shooting ourselves in the foot if we continue this anti-America, hissy fit. And this is the kind of reason I'm trying to talk into our government and some of the Liberals who have just gone way off the reservation on this.
Shannon, how significant is it that Poilievre publicly said this week, that's his position, I speak for the party, and also that he didn't agree with what Jivani said?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty grotesque gaslighting from Jivani. That's an interesting version of the last year. I think it creates two different problems for Poilievre. One is one of his weaknesses through the last election, through the last year, has been how he's trying to tiptoe along this line, not saying anything too critical of Donald Trump because of the idea that a sizable portion of his base thinks he's great. This muddies those waters horribly in a moment when the Canadian public at large has no time for equivocating on whether, the U.S. has lost its mind or Donald Trump's a bad guy. The other thing is that Jamil Jivani looks like a very self-interested operator here, and maybe even looks like he would eventually like to challenge Pierre Poilievre for leadership. So it makes things very messy, and it introduces, I think, a multi-front war where Poilievre is having to hive off his party, saying he doesn't speak for us, we don't think that way because that's politically toxic, but also fending off this idea that this guy is trying to make himself an alternate power source.
Stuart, does Jamil Jivani want Pierre Poilievre's job?
Well, I think the percentage of people in the Conservative caucus who would take Pierre Poilievre's job at some point in the future if they were offered it is pretty high. It's probably close to 100%. So the question is what he's doing counterproductive, or is it overstepping in his own sort of personal ambitions, or is it interfering with Pierre Poilievre in a way that is going to end in him being smacked down? And I think he got pretty close to that. And I would say the charitable case for Jivani is that he has a genuinely unique connection with the government that we're involved in a trade war with. And personal connections in Ottawa, as we all know, are pretty important. The former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had an adjacent cottage with the former Governor General in the Laurentians, and that was, something that helped both of them. So these personal connections do matter. And I think up until the point that he went on Breitbart, his message was pretty banal. It was, I'm just trying to make friends here and take the steam out of this. And that, I think, is something we've seen with, especially we saw it with Pierre Poilievre. He went on a podcast and, talked about the RCMP in a way that he now regrets. When you're a little too comfortable on these podcasts, sometimes you say something that you end up regretting.
But if the podcast is also a CBC radio show, then you should come on because it's always a good time. Shannon, so with this floor crossing by Genereux, Mark Carney could get a majority government, but that's only if the Liberals win the 3 by-elections that we're expecting. That includes Terrebonne, where they beat the Bloc by just 1 vote last time. If you are Pierre Poilievre, are you perhaps hoping for a Liberal majority so that you can avoid an election right now?
Oh, that's an interesting way to flip it, because I've been thinking about it from the Liberal end of things, that if they're looking at the polls, it's understandable some people in their comms or in their strategy shop might be kind of stamping their feet thinking, let's roll the dice, let's go. And to me, the safer bet is to get your majority one at a time. It looks like they are still able to peel people off quietly. That Terrebonne seat is the only one. The other two are very safe Liberal seats. I can guarantee you that a ton of resources are going to be poured into that riding. It will become nationalized. I suppose for Poilievre, that is a much more palatable way to quote unquote lose, because you're not contesting anything. He can, and I would expect would, trot out the message that it's illegitimate in some way. It's not really, but it would leave a strange taste in people's mouths if he sort of gets it piecemeal. So I think that is an easier case for him to make. Whereas if Pierre Poilievre runs a second election against Mark Carney and loses, I think he would have a very hard time holding on to the leadership at that point. He was so dominant, and you could see it in the faces of Conservatives at Conservative HQ on election night. Just this stunned feeling of it was so firmly within their grasp. It wasn't even theirs to lose, it was theirs. And bizarre things happened, but to run a second election and not be able to win it, I think would be a death knell for him.
Stuart?
Well, I think there are two sides to this, because if you're Mark Carney and you've been hearing these critiques from Pierre Poilievre, and then you say, well, actually, we're going to win a Democratic by-election to get the majority, that might actually sit a little bit better for him. The other side of that, though, is that if you're the Bloc in this riding and you like your chances anyways, because I think that's a good riding for them, they now have the best ballot question they could have hoped for. They have all the enthusiasm they could have hoped for, because they're going to say, this is our chance to stop Mark Carney getting a majority. It's our job. And I think the one thing you need in a by-election is enthusiasm, because they're pretty low turnout. So I think the Bloc would like it either way.
So I'll say all eyes on Terrebonne, but given the way politics is going, who knows? More drips, more by-elections.
Wait 5 minutes.
We will see, indeed. But so glad to have analysis from both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Shannon Proudfoot of the Globe and Mail and Stuart Thompson of the National Post. Still to come on the House podcast, the government is betting big on Canada's defence industry. But will we really be able to make a lot more of our own military equipment in this country? The promise and peril after the break. I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode. And tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca.
The inside of these storage units, kind of like Arizona. It's kept at 21 degrees and about 3 or 4% humidity.
In a nondescript warehouse in an Ottawa suburb, Micah Grinstead shows off the high-tech assembly line where thousands of little antennae are being made.
And then we get to here, this is the fun machine. I call this the money printer, really. It puts down 147,000 components an hour. So these are the actual these little dots that you can see here. Each one of these little dots is actually a component.
Grinstead works for a large Canadian defence contractor called Calian. This part of the company makes antennae with highly precise GPS capabilities. They can pinpoint a location to within millimeters. They have a few military uses, for instance in drones and for anti-jamming abilities, like when the enemy is trying to block your communications.
This machine here is a fancy machine from a company called Omron. It does 28,000 inspections in 14 minutes. This is worth its weight in gold.
This part of Calian's business has been growing steadily, and the new defence industrial strategy announced by the Prime Minister this week means more growth is on the way, according to Chris Pogue, president of Calian Defence and Space.
The facility you're in right now is a facility that's grown 4 times in just the past couple of years in terms of, and the demand globally for what they do. So we're already hiring, we're already expanding because of the demand for the capability that was built here in Canada. As we go into this next strategy, where it's a strategy of building, partnering, or buying from others, where we say build and we think about the kind of stuff that needs to be built in Canada, those will lead to tons and tons of great paying jobs, but also jobs that generate intellectual property. And that intellectual property means that that same company can now export to a global market. It can build not just jobs, but wealth. And I think that's a key part of this story that Canada is embarking on.
The government's long-awaited defence industrial strategy was announced Tuesday. It's supposed to spur economic growth and create over 125,000 jobs, while also creating a robust defence industry here in Canada, one that's not so reliant on the Americans. But procurement in this country has been notoriously slow. Pogue says whether this strategy works will depend on everyone involved.
I think everyone has to behave differently if we want to make a strategy work. The Prime Minister has put the vehicle in gear, right? He's moved the transmission into drive. But there's a lot of things between that move into drive and all the gears to actually have the vehicle move forward and the wheels spin, or the wheels drive you forward. And that means industry has to be willing to behave differently. We have to interact differently. We have to create more collective industry where we're trying to solve a problem rather than fighting over it. I believe this is a moment where we're trying to grow an industry, and we should grow it together rather than try to fight over some smaller piece.
So, will this new strategy mean the Canadian military will get the equipment it needs? Murray Brewster is the CBC's senior defense correspondent. Murray, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm happy to be here.
So, we have this big, sweeping strategy. It has been in the works for a long time. What is the goal, fundamentally?
The purpose is twofold. Rebuild the country's defense industrial base, which has largely crumbled or been mothballed since the end of the Cold War. And the second intent is to rearm the Canadian military as quickly as possible. I would suggest, though, that there's a greater emphasis on the economic side of the strategy based upon what we've seen this week.
It does feel like we've been here before, that we want Canada to get the payoff in terms of jobs, economic boost when we buy military equipment. You can think of the shipbuilding program, for instance. How is this strategy different from what's been done in the past?
Well, we have been trying to do this for years with varying levels of success. The whole federal department has been built around the concept of extracting promises from major international defense companies. And essentially, the best example I can give you is we spend $20 billion on a piece of military equipment. The winning bidder has to promise to spend the equivalent in Canada, and that can be sprinkled across different economic sectors. For example, Irving Shipbuilding invested $40 million in an Alberta French fry plant a few years ago as part of its offset for building warships.
French fries.
French fries.
Okay.
Needless to say, it is complicated and bureaucratic. It's contributed to delays for getting military equipment. Now, what the strategy is intended to do is give clear guidance. Priority number one, buy at home. Now, if they can't do that, then they can go out and see what allies have, and perhaps they can partner with allies to buy together. Now, if they can't do that, then it's a matter of buying off the shelf. I mean, industry is kind of qualified in its assessment of whether the strategy is going to work. Here's Kristen Cianforani of the Canadian Association of Defence and Security Industries, the lobby group that represents Canadian military contractors.
Anything is possible. Will it be challenging? It absolutely will be. This procurement system has not been able to be reformed in the last 12 years that I have been in my current role, and in the last sort of 30 years that I've been in the defense industry. So it is not going to be easy to reform this very, very large and monolithic and somewhat spindly procurement system that we've been using for a very long time. But the start of it is at least ensuring that the political will to do something like this is there.
So that's a perspective from the defense industry. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, shared his perspective this week. Let's listen to what he is saying about Mark Carney's plan.
His new proposal adds 6 new bureaucracies, agencies, councils, units, and other bureaucracies that will actually gum up and slow the system down. He's got a new $1 million man heading up the Military Investment Agency, a guy who doesn't even have a military background. We don't need more high-priced CEOs and bureaucrats.
What do you make of what he said there?
Well, he's not entirely accurate. I mean, according to testimony before the House of Commons Government Operations Committee recently, Doug Guzman, who is the CEO of the Defense Investment Agency, Mr. Poilievre is referring to, basically, Guzman testified that the agency has thus far stolen bureaucrats from already existing departments, DND, PSPC, ISED, telling them to bring their defense files with them. Now, when the industry says it's worried about bureaucracy, what it means is that there are still too many chefs in the decision-making kitchen, chefs who are not willing to stick their neck out to get projects moving. Here's Kristen Cianforani again.
The top is different of this organization, and it has been let's say, removed and focused outside of the line department, which is public services and procurement. So it may have a better chance to be more directive and less pulled in all directions, you could say. But make no mistake about it, we do have, and we have expressed a concern that if those individuals and the political will most certainly are not heavily involved in directing the public service to make changes, then this could be the Achilles heel of the strategy.
Always have to be worried about the Achilles heel of a strategy. One of the fundamental questions here, though, Murray, you addressed this off the top, is actually equipping the Canadian military, getting equipment into their hands. So what is our sense of how likely this strategy is to do that?
Well, the fact remains is the Canadian military's equipment is in rough shape, and we heard how rough earlier this week when defense officials said only 42% of the Air Force's inventory is ready to fight. 51% of the Army is ready to go, and 68% of the Navy. Now, they need new equipment now, and it has been for the pieces of military equipment and getting them into their hands that there has been the biggest struggle. So essentially, to get equipment into the military's hands reasonably quickly, we may have to end up skipping step one of the strategy and maybe even step two and buying off the shelf from either the U.S. or other allies. Now, what folks have to understand is that Canada has very few arms manufacturers in this country that produce equipment from raw material to finished product. We build components. And a big chunk of the defense industry in this country has been what one expert describes as a branch plant economy, with big U.S. contractors opening Canadian subsidiaries, many of which manufacture parts. Now, there are some exceptions to this, for example, GDLS in London, Ontario. But the purpose of this strategy is to make us more sovereign and independent. The question is, how do you do that when your industry is largely building parts to feed into the U.S. system or even the Allied system? Here's Wendy Gilmore, a Canadian and former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Investment at NATO.
Challenges to our sovereignty can come in many ways, and we need to have the independence of action to respond to those. So that speaks to continuing to work with the U.S., but figuring out a way to source and to access capabilities that are not directly tied to American largesse. There's nothing in this strategy that says that we're not going to continue to be a branch plant economy for military capabilities.
Where President Trump just signed an executive order earlier this month outlining an American strategy to push more American military exports to allies. How much is Canada really going to be able to avoid the United States when it comes to military equipment?
Well, it really depends on how far we want to go with developing an arms export market for Canadian munitions and high-tech systems. I mean, the U.S. is the premier arms maker in the world, and the executive order wants to reinforce selling to allies and making them dependent upon U.S. weapon systems. I mean, for the most part, America builds the fighter jets, the tanks, the vehicles that allies want. Just ask the Canadian Air Force. But if Canada continues to be largely a parts manufacturer and feeding into the U.S. system, then no, the executive order is not going to be a big deal. But if we want to turn away from the U.S., as the PM has said, and develop our own world-class gear, then yes, we're going to be running headlong into the U.S. And we actually got a hint of that this week when the U.S. warned European allies against adopting defense policies that would favor their own domestic industries.
Now, another part of this strategy is increasing Canadian defense exports, and that does mean potentially selling weapons to countries that some Canadians may not be comfortable with. What is the government saying about that priority, Mary?
Not very much. I mean, it is the sort of elephant in the room, I guess. I mean, you and I, Catherine, have been around long enough to remember the political fight over selling light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia and all of the human rights concerns that went around with that deal. Now, that seems to be shunted to the side for the moment. And the fact remains is if Canada is going to have an arms industry, it's going to have to develop export markets, something that the previous government was reluctant to do, but this one seems to be determined to do.
A lot to process there. Thank you for putting it all into perspective for us, Murray.
You're welcome.
The CBC's Murray Brewster. So, lots of questions about how buying Canadian will get equipment to Canadian troops. Stephen Fuhr is the Secretary of State for Defence Procurement. Welcome to the House.
Thanks for having me.
We've seen defense strategies before, and now with increased military spending, you want to procure much more than ever before. What makes you think it's going to work this time?
Well, first of all, I think all parties have agreed for a number of decades that decentralized defense procurement wasn't delivering things on much of a timeline that made sense to anybody, and that needed to change. So we had slow delivery of capability to the armed forces, which usually drove up costs, so things showed up late and expensive. And now, which adds another layer of complexity to that with technology changing so quickly, if we didn't change the way we were doing things, it would show up late, expensive, and irrelevant because technology will have outpaced our ability to deliver. So I've said this a couple of times, and it's totally true. This is an all-party everyone agreed this needed to be done. It was largely informed by the National Defense Committee's report in 2024, how this Defense Investment Agency was constituted. And the big thing that's different than any other effort in the past is this shop, and in my case, me at this point, because I'm heading it. I have authority. I have contracting authority for the Government of Canada for purchases, defense procurement over $100 million. We have resources, and the budget that we've been talking about for several months now has money in the budget to spend on defense procurement. So we have all the ingredients we need to press forward at a pace that will meet the moment.
So you say, all party agreement that certainly that something needed to happen, that things needed to improve. But I'm sure you're aware that the Conservatives are saying that ultimately you're just adding more bureaucracy. And some of what we heard from industry is that they are worried about decisions actually getting made in a timely fashion. So how do you reassure all those folks?
Well, I would just point to the obvious. We just announced the DIS a few days ago. And my shop, the Defense Investment Agency, has really only been stood up officially for several months, a couple of months, just before, it was November. But we've already moved on procurements. We announced a contract award on Global 6500 for the RCAF to replace the Challengers. We announced a strategic partnership with Telesat MDA to deliver mill-grade SATCOM to the Canadian Armed Forces. And submarines. Every critic in Ottawa, I haven't heard one that's kind of scratching their head going, hey, they're on a path to success. Out of the gate, we are going to more likely than not announcing a winner on subs this year in 2026, and we're tracking to have subs in the water by 2032. Contrast to what was on the calendar prior to the DIA getting involved, it was contract award in 2028, sub in the water by 2035. So those are three tangible examples of the rate that we're moving in a very short period of time.
The submarines in particular, though, those are going to be built by other countries. I appreciate you say it's happening faster, but when we get to this question about beefing up the industry in Canada, we heard from Wendy Gilmore a few minutes ago who says ultimately Canada is kind of a branch plant of the United States. Is it realistic to imagine that Canada is going to shift into building a significant amount of military equipment on its own because of this strategy?
Yes. All we need to do is nurture it. It's there. We just haven't nurtured it properly. The default position, for whatever reason, over time has been U.S. foreign military sales. We just got comfortable doing it that way. And it was just something that we did without really thinking about it. But we have world-class capability and capacity in a number of places. Aerospace. Canada is one of the only countries in the world that can design, build, and certify a transport category aircraft. We need to preserve that. Canada is only one of the only countries in the world that can design and build a heavy icebreaker. Other countries are starting to take notice of that. AI, aerospace, space, MDA space. We have amazing capacity and capability here. I haven't even started to get down to our SMEs, which are also very awesome. We just need to invest in them and help them get a leg up, and we will do that.
The United States released its own America First defense strategy, and one of their priorities is to sell military equipment to allies. So you're talking about beefing up Canada here. Have you had any assurances from the Americans that Canada's plan isn't going to tick them off? Because we see what happens when the president is not happy.
Well, we've all kind of come to the realization that we need to be more resilient, right? We just can't depend on the U.S. like we used to, and we're going to do that. So some of those areas that I mentioned, aerospace, shipbuilding, space, AI, where we're already world-class, we're just going to do more at making sure that where we can just buy from ourselves and also help promote exports. Everybody on this planet wants to work with Canada right now.
Well, Minister, the question isn't should we be more resilient? The question I was asking is, are we going to feel some heat from the Americans for it, which is a different thing? Do you have any assurances that they're not going to be mad?
I don't, competition's good. And if we're going to compete with the Americans in some spaces, then that's just what's going to happen. I mean, competition is good for everybody, the customer, the space, and Canada can compete and Canada can win. And we're going to demonstrate that going forward.
If this strategy works as you hope, I wonder if you believe most Canadians are comfortable with the idea that a significant plank of the Canadian economy becomes about providing not just military equipment, but in some cases weapons to the world.
Well, I mean, I think where I'm looking, and I'm pretty sensitive to what's going on. I think right now there's big support for this. I don't think I know. If I look around, I talk to a lot of people, I read a lot of materials. There is big support for this. It's one of the planks to us being more resilient. One Canadian economy, we've talked about that, major projects, Build Canada Homes, and defense procurement. Those four things are going to help Canada move its own way where it has to, economically speaking.
Well, I guess what I've wondered, though, Minister, is I hear you that we've been talking a lot about doing more for Canada, but I do wonder whether Canadians understand when it comes to how much money we spend in this country, how much more of a priority our military is really going to be.
I think that we will have the support. I think we have the support of Canadians on this right now. I think all the evidence would bear that out. But I think a large part of that is driven by circumstance. This circumstance that we find ourselves in may, persist, a year, 2, 3, 4. I don't know how long. I think that sentiment, this is my opinion, will remain as long as Canadians see value in that. And what I mean by that is if it's not just about ships in the harbor and planes on the ramp and tanks in the field, it's about stimulating the Canadian economy and creating good jobs and careers for people. I think they'll support it as long as it's doing those other things. I think we'll have the support as long as we need it.
Okay. Minister Stephen Fuhr, thank you for this.
Thanks very much.
Stephen Fuhr is the Secretary of State for Defense Procurement. While floor crossing has thrust plenty of attention on the Liberals and Conservatives this week, the New Democrats are entering the final stretch of their leadership race. 5 contenders took to the stage on Thursday for one last debate.
I know how to win. I know how to build support. I know how to beat Conservatives. We need a leader who can win. We need a leader who can rebuild, and I am that leader.
Now the NDP has a clear choice. The same approach that brought us to an historic low in the last election, or a new vision that is unmistakably bold and courageous.
The working class just doesn't see themselves in us anymore. So they went and found another home. And so we need to bring them back.
We need a guaranteed livable basic income. We need a wealth tax. We have to end the fossil fuel subsidies.
As a farmer, I see our world from ground level. It's a very different perspective from those who have been making destructive decisions from the corner offices of corporate towers.
Off the top, that was Heather McPherson, Avi Lewis, Rob Ashton, Tenille Johnston, and Tony McQuail, the 5 candidates vying to lead the federal NDP. Are any of those visions enough to help New Democrats thrive? Or is the party that won just 7 seats in the last election simply trying to survive? I'm joined by 2 former New Democrat MPs for their take. Nathan Cullen represented Northwest BC for 15 years, later joining the provincial NDP government in that province. And Matthew Green held the Hamilton Centre seat from 2019 through to last year. Welcome back to the House, both of you.
Thank you so much. Nice to be here.
Now, I should start by saying that neither of you are officially backing any of these leadership candidates. You're not working on their campaigns. Before we get into what they're putting on the table, I just want a brief thought from both of you. What do you think the federal NDP needs right now most in a leader, Nathan?
I'm going to go with 2 things. It needs attention and it needs energy. Needs that reason for people to look over with so much space being made available by Mr. Carney on the left and center left. And it needs that energy of where we're at, which is in that rebuild, re-energize, reconnect phase with people who were involved with the party, but also people who say they're open to voting for the party, which is 35-40% of Canadians, but are not saying they're support us right now, which is 6, 8, 10%. So those are the 2 things that I'm looking for.
Matthew, you were one of the NDP MPs who lost their seat in last year's election. There are no New Democrats representing Ontario in the House of Commons right now. What do you think the next leader needs to do to rebuild what was lost?
I would say a plan, an operational plan, one that takes the values of New Democrats from coast to coast to coast and operationalizes it in neighborhoods, in ridings that are winnable, ridings that have had seats, ridings where we're finding the most inroads, because, I do think that this is going to be a process. And so without anticipating an orange wave, although things do happen fast in politics, as we've just witnessed, I think that what I'm looking for most out of a leadership is a willingness to authentically and honestly engage with what went wrong and then change course, because we've tried a very similar approach over the last couple of elections, focusing solely on a leader and an individual. And I think now's the time where we go back to our base and go back to our membership and build out from there.
Well, Matthew, any leader will say, I've got a plan. Like, how concerned are you that this is really going to happen or not in a way that would bring the kind of change you're looking for?
Well, I think listening last night, we heard bits of a plan. What we're hearing are platforms. And I think when we as New Democrats debate platforms, as was put last night, was referenced, we violently agree on many things. But that presupposes we're going to form government. And I think that if we're being honest and we're looking at what our pathway back into relevance electorally is, it's going to start with getting party status. And so that is less about what we're promising when we're in government and more about articulating how we're going to regain the so-called working class that left us, how we're going to have inroads in urban centers that got annihilated in the last election through incumbent seats, and get to a place where first, we regain that party status and have a solid foothold in a potential minority setting, and so that the working class values of Canadians are still reflected, because as we know, that's not the case now. We ended up with two conservative style governments or two conservative style parties.
And I will note, you talk about keeping party status. Even now with 7 MPs, there have been questions about Laurie Idlout crossing over to the Liberals. There are questions about whether the only Quebec MP for the NDP, Alexandra Boulouris, might leave for provincial politics. So there's even just the question of keeping the MPs that you have. I want to dig further, though, into the state of this race. There are two perceived frontrunners, Edmonton MP Heather McPherson and filmmaker and activist Avi Lewis. We're going to hear from both of them. Let's start with McPherson and how she framed her pitch for the leadership during the debate.
So many of the things that define us as Canadians, things that separate us from the United States, are there because of New Democrats. We have a responsibility to live up to that and win more seats so that we can do even more for people. I have a plan. I have a record, and I have the energy to hold this government accountable until we are government.
Here's Avi Lewis touching on some of his proposals during the debate.
A public option for groceries, cell phones, internet connection, a public bank through Canada Post and postal banking. These are measures emphasizing the responsibility of the government to step up and govern and use our public resources in the public interest. Not everybody on this stage is willing to go there, but that's the only way that Canada can build a Trump-proof economy.
Nathan, what stands out to you when you line up those two candidates side by side?
They're tonally very different. The way Heather is presenting herself as a pragmatic, careful, collaborative leader, this is her approach. Avi is more on the he's very good at expressing big ideas in very few words. As somebody who's been in the media understands is important. He's presenting himself as bold and risk-taking, and that is the pathway through, not being careful, but taking chances, suggesting things that might be unpopular, cause controversy. And I think because the ideas that he believes in themselves, but also as an attempt to get more attention, like I talked about earlier.
Matthew?
Yeah, I would say even in that opening section of remarks from Heather, I think that Heather missed an opportunity to stick with the we's and do a lot less of the I's. And what that tells me is that the people that are around her are very much the status quo communicators that will shape the party under the personification of a leader. And in that way, I think Nathan is quite right. She does represent a very status quo, pragmatic path forward. And I think on the other side, what Avi offered is bold. And I think the question that people will always have when it comes to New Democrats with bold ideas is how will you pay for it and how will you get it done? And so I think this represents a bit of a clash between a status quo kind of outlook versus a more kind of bold and coalition movement-based approach, a more collective approach on the other side with Avi.
Well, Nathan, it's not just, though, as Matthew says, how will you pay for it and how will you get it done, but also, is it the right choice? And Avi certainly is putting out some more bold ideas, for instance, talking this week about not meeting that 2% of GDP NATO spending requirement. But do you think that's where Canadians are right now, that those are the kind of ideas they want to hear more about? It does. The opinion polls suggest it's offside with the majority.
Yeah, potentially. These are always two steps, right? The first step is becoming leaders. So your first pool of people you're appealing to in every leadership race is to your membership, obviously. I think there might be New Democrats that are uncomfortable with the accelerated military spending, maybe, and some of the ideas that Avi's putting forward that are more bold, potentially. The next stage, the important one, is appealing to all those places Matthew talked about, all those Canadians who, again, polling tells us are open to voting NDP, but frankly got terrified by the threats in the last election coming from south of the border that remain and will likely be there next time we go to the polls, unfortunately. But also we're not excited by what the previous leader was offering or the way he was offering it, and said, sorry, this time I got to go park my vote somewhere else. So it's okay to be controversial or to propose things that are outside of the norm. The NDP has a long, proud, and sometimes unfortunate history of being right on really big issues. But 10, 20 years before the rest of the politic body catches up, before Canadians catch up on immigration, Chinese head tax, like the list is long.
But is this the sort of traditional, like NDP as the conscience of Parliament rather than people who could form power?
Well, the candidates were all asked that question. I thought the responses were interesting. Are you running for prime minister or are you running to rebuild? And they overwhelmingly said rebuild, including both Avi and Heather, the two front-running candidates. I was there when Jack said, I'm running to be prime minister, and the press gallery, no offense, you could hear the guffaws. But I kind of liked it in the boldness and the readiness to think about what it is to govern, which is really important, because it's not a debating society. This is not something where you just throw around ideas, and as Matthew says, whether they're practical or not is not so important. This is you saying this is what you would do with power. Now, we are many steps away from that moment, but that moment has come. And if we had a nickel for every time the folks said the NDP was done forever, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd be better off than I am now. So the NDP will be back, and being back with ideas that may be on the bleeding edge a bit, but you can also turn folks off, as you say, Catherine, to the point where they say, gosh, I kind of like you guys, but that seems like just a bridge too far, given the circumstances we're in facing Mr. Trump and the uncertainty in the world.
Matthew, we just have a moment left, but I do want to ask you about the fact that in some provinces, we are not seeing NDP MLAs or MPPs endorse anyone in this federal race. Alberta's Naheed Nenshi has made it clear he's not a member of the federal party. He won't be voting for a federal leader. What does this desire to sit this conversation out tell you, Matthew?
Well, I think that there's a discussion to be had about the nature of our relationships as a federated party between the provinces and the federal side of our party. And I think it's healthy. I think that there should be room for disagreements regionally. We are regionally very different in many ways. Now, we're common as New Democrats based on our values, but I don't think that that is something we should be afraid of, that we should run from. I think it's something that we need to engage, and perhaps convention will allow for that to happen. But ultimately, I think that Canadians are better served when New Democrats are elected in Alberta and Manitoba and Saskatchewan and BC and right across the country. And I also think that there's a space where there is common ground, where our shared values about how government should operate nationally can be the place in which our provincial counterparts seek to get on side. But sitting this one out, and particularly with Mr. Nenshi, I don't see that as a big warning sign. I think we kind of knew who he was coming into this. He hasn't changed. It's not like he's abandoned the federal NDP. I'm just not clear he was ever there to begin with.
Okay. Well, that's quite a note to end this conversation on. We're right out of time, though. Thank you both for this.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much.
Former NDP MPs Matthew Green and Nathan Cullen. The NDP will choose their new leader on March 29th. Okay, that is it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Kristen Everson, Emma Godmere, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plant. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.